Welcome to the Poetry Vlog. My name is Ray, and this is Matty. Matty, what can our viewers expect for today's episode?
Oh, I mean, great conversation, some Captain Planet, a little bit of Wicked, and, thinking about what it's like to live in Utah.
Absolutely. Welcome to the Poetry Vlog. You may have noticed that I am not C.R. Grimmer. My name is Ray Kaplan, and I'm going to be conducting this interview today with the lovely Matty. Matty, would you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Matty Layne Glasgow. I am a poet and nonfiction writer living in Salt Lake City. I currently work at the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah, where I am wrapping up a PhD in creative writing and English literature. And I do have a book of poetry called Deciduous Qween that came out several years ago, but she's on her last legs.
Incredible. And what would you like to read for us today?
Sure, I might read a little campy poem about one of my favorite cartoons growing up, Captain Planet. This is the ecological anime at its finest. It's called The Power Bottom Is Yours for Captain Planet. I wanted you then, all the silver blue and crystalline, waves of muscle washing over your body, your hydro-powered biceps, turbine thighs, washboard abs. I imagined my tongue gliding through every trough, pausing on each crest. You were the world in my child eyes. Even now, that green mullet has me crying, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." So I guess I've always loved your planet. Just call me Matty, all heart with a big gay monkey on my back. Was it always so obvious? Did those planeteers see him sitting there before I even knew? It's strange how shame can change the climate of our cheeks, how it tastes like petrol when it leaks from my veins. You always said the power is yours, but I want to give it back to you. This ring glows heavy on my hand. It's all earth and fire, wind and water, but no love left in this drowning world.
That's amazing.
Sorry, kind of a bummer ending there, I forgot.
Why did you pick this particular passage to read for us today?
Yeah, I think this book in particular kind of goes back and thinks a lot about like the queer child,
yes.
Before I even knew I was queer, and where my gaze was going when I didn't even know what a gaze was or what the gays were. And so I think this, and I also love pop culture. I kind of was also working on a sequence of Captain Planet inspired poems at that time that haven't really gone anywhere. And I love a pun, so Power Bottom, the power is yours, that was just a title. I think the title honestly came first for a lot of the poems in this book. But I'm also very interested in the ecological grief and hardship that's going on in the world right now, and that, I wish Captain Planet had reached more people to potentially prevent some of the cataclysmic climate change and industrial extraction that is going on these days. So I think it kind of represents an intersection of environmental interests and queer identity that played a pretty big role in the book overall.
Absolutely. And I think that is really relevant to talking about specifically queerness in Utah, because this is a state with a culture that overwhelmingly will repress sexuality, especially in children, as much as physically possible. And I guess I'll segue that into, you are not from Utah, correct?
Yeah, I grew up mostly in and around Houston. We lived really briefly in London and in Bakersfield, California. My father was in oil, so this is also informing a lot of kind of my current interest.
All comes together.
He is divested in some ways and is doing different things than he used to, but it's also a reckoning of where one's privilege comes from. I would say in work that I'm working on now, I'm thinking a lot about that privilege and how I grew up and how I am now. And so I don't know. I think Utah is similar to Texas in some ways, but I think the presence of the LDS Church in particular has been different for me. I will say I'm pretty privileged living in Salt Lake City. I think it is a queer haven for a lot of people. I think it has in the U.S., it has one of the highest per capita populations of queer folks, which is great. But I'm also a cis white man living here, so coming here for graduate school, I have faced a lot less. I mean, there have been some interesting experiences. But I've certainly faced a lot less than my like femme friends or like friends who are not like cis males living here. So and that way I've been able to enjoy a lot of Utah, but also always trying to find community with those around us. And I think we stay in like small queer circles in some way. We don't necessarily go outside of our department a lot sometimes, but there's even like nice I guess interdisciplinary work going on at the U. So I've met some new like queer scientists, and hearing about how queerness works within the sciences is a whole different animal in the humanities.
Of course.
That's been a lot to learn too. Yeah. Absolutely. But yeah, Utah itself, I will say I like living in Utah. I think it's beautiful. There are things that I wish would change very quickly. And those things are changing, but in not the direction that I would like them to change in terms of some of these legislative agendas coming up this year. And even affects beyond just the humanities itself at the U. I mean, it's kind of it's a very strange time to be at a public school in the state, for sure. Yeah,
and I think it's super important that you still are able to like Utah and like being here. Because one of the biggest things about this is breaking down the narrative to all of these like upcoming writers who are trying to figure out how to do this, who are in Utah, that they don't necessarily have to run to New York City or run to LA in order to ever find peace and success.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think one thing I value about having lived, or all of my graduate education has been in red states, and so everyone does not have the privilege or the ability to just flee to a more like accommodating environment. And I have queer communities in the Houston area and throughout Texas. I've been in Austin for a little while too. Did my MFA in Ames, Iowa, which is another kind of rural agricultural school primarily, but had quite a few like queer writing friends in like my program. And so I think being able to create queer spaces in those states and in those cities is even to be more important because there is a lot more aggressive hostility directly surrounding them.
Absolutely.
And so sure, I would love to live in some other areas, but I also think doing the work in these spaces and even reaching out and trying to like explain to people that like we're not monsters.
Yeah,
like that drag queen story time is great, and you don't need to call in a bomb threat to the King's English just because it's scheduled. I mean, some wild things have happened in this city, but
absolutely. And I think it is absolutely proven that one of the most important ways to break down all of these biases and prejudices is by existing openly, and because. Like, psychologically, it is harder to hate and demonize someone that you know? And, like, I mean, I'm thinking of, like, Ender's Game, where, where you get to know the enemy, and then you love the enemy, you know?
I do, I agree. I think it is kind of, like, an act of love, or certainly, like, empathy, like, understanding that, some people who might have these thoughts have, like, never been around, like, a gay man or, like, a trans person. Like,
absolutely.
We do not have to necessarily start with hostility with them. Obviously, we would like them not to start with hostility too. That kind of works. Reciprocity is very important. But I've like, after the election in like 2020, like I stopped talking to a lot of family members, and I have like started texting with some of them. And I think like establishing those boundaries can also be really helpful, because then you're doing the work, but you're also doing like self-care and protecting yourself, and not feeling like you need to. It's not your responsibility to change them.
Yes.
It's your responsibility to live and to try to find joy and pleasure where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And like stories of queer joy are so important. It's where that's like I love that poem that you chose to read so much, also because it is. I mean, the end is very real and darker, but it's still a joyful experience. Like exploring one's sexuality is not this image of huddled up in a dark corner, rolling back and forth, hating yourself necessarily. Yeah. I mean, it can be that, but it is important for people to.
It has been that.
It has been that.
Every poem does not have to be that. But I agree. Like I love I like a polytonal poem anyways. Like I always want to have humor and joy, and then perhaps move into something more serious, or like thinking about a more existential threat, either internally or externally. And I just like that polytonal nature of any poem or piece I'm working on. Especially, I find it a little easier to do that in like creative nonfiction. There's just a little more space to go through those ebbs and flows. But I'm glad you found some joy in that.
Absolutely.
That was certainly a hope.
Absolutely. So, just for any of our viewers who aren't aware or who aren't from Utah and like living this experience, what are some of these like legislative policies that are harming queer people right now?
Yeah, I think especially the last 2 sessions, they have not always passed, and some have been revised, but it put forth legislation related to like trans restrooms or just the openness of restrooms in general, and even just a broader attack, not just on the queer community, like on education. There's like a threat of reducing public, or at least at my college, a reduction of 10% from what we're already working at. And so I think it's important to know that they are specifically targeting queer individuals, and they're also targeting institutions that tend to provide support for queer folks, especially like the large flagship universities in the state, which has made it quite difficult in my current job thinking about I am not suffering financially, but we are trying to think about what the future is going to look like next semester or the year after that if they close the College of Humanities. They also at the U was forced to close basically every identity related center, and I use that very broadly. Like the queer center at the U is no longer. That closed over the summer, and that was directly related to the legislation that passed. They've also kind of had to restructure where like the Center for Black Students is located. I think the only center that survived fairly unscathed was kind of our Native American Institute to some extent, and that's because the Ute tribe does work pretty closely with the U, given their long-standing partnership. Right. So it's just kind of like a crisis on all fronts right now, and I think there is a lot of worry. Obviously, I think there's always been worry within the queer community. I think there's also a lot of worry for allies that have been trying to do that work now too. It's becoming harder and harder to really be in it and get those resources without question, or a lot of hoops to jump through.
Absolutely. So with that said, and the desperation potentially of the situation that we're currently in, what are you finding that's bringing you hope right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think like little things. I do watch The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City on a weekly basis, and that's always a fun hour. I wouldn't necessarily call it aspirational, but I love to watch. Big Bronwyn fan. I mean, she's bringing the fashion, and she is not here for the hypocrisy this season. She is ready to just let everyone know what everyone's saying, and I kind of identify with that. But also, in pop culture-wise, thinking about like Wicked. I mean, I can't think of a better film than Wicked, which also blends together like a queer narrative of someone who is green, who is raised by a mother bear, and it also is giving an animal rights narrative, reimagining Oz in this way. And so I think when we see something that big and wonderful, I think it's a fabulous adaptation of the stage play, which I loved, and is really important to me because Wicked was probably my mom and I's like show that we saw together more than once. And so I've always loved the music, but since she passed away, like songs like For Good have kind of taken on a completely different like tone. And so seeing something that is so important to me, or was so formative for me as a piece of art, being brought more mainstream, I don't think that's a bad thing. Like I enjoy going to the movie theater. And I think that has given me a lot of hope in thinking about the ways in which these types of narratives, and also as Wicked, the novel was written by a gay man, a gay white man named, oh my god, what is this, McGuire? Last name McGuire, I can't remember. Also, haven't read the novel, so maybe I should invoke it, but I would love to read it now after seeing so many fabulous adaptations of it. But it is kind of ways in which queer art are making it to the mainstream. And maybe that's a way to open a question with people who are more hostile to it in Utah. Like, well, have you seen Wicked? Like, do you know what that is about? Like, how did you read that film? Absolutely. And so I think they can, especially with these like broader productions and pieces of art, and reimaginings, can open a space for a conversation. I think people might be more willing to talk about film.
Because, not everyone will have had the experience of being queer, but everyone has felt othered at some point in their life, and everyone has felt like left out and wrong and isolated in some way. And that I think media and poetry is a great way to bring that connection to anyone, no matter where they're starting out from.
And I mean, and I saw Wicked in the film last week with one of my best poet friends, who y'all might meet at some point. And she was like sobbing or crying like everybody. Like, it is a polytonal text, polytonal film that really does get to like the highs and lows of like camp and joy. And understanding that camp can be serious. In fact, we do take camp seriously,
Absolutely.
whether we are trying to get humor out of it or something deeper in terms of, not that humor can't be deep, but maybe a more like precise activism or precise kind of goal for the project.
Yeah. How would you tell the story of getting Deciduous Queen published?
Yeah, so I think Deciduous Queen is kind of a shortened version of my MFA thesis, so I cut quite a bit out of my thesis. And started sending it out my last year when I was at Iowa State, so I was probably sending it out in like 2017. I was very lucky in that I sent it to 3 presses, and one of them did end up picking it up, but it was a very, like, I think when you're sending work out, especially as a queer writer, you should be looking for judges that they themselves might be queer or have shown an interest in queer work. So Richard Blanco was the judge of the contest that eventually picked it up. I really enjoyed his work, and that's kind of how I've continued to go about with later books, or my second manuscript, is finding places where I think the readers would find it interesting, mostly because it is expensive, and oftentimes, especially like emerging writers and queer writers, do not have trust funds from which we can pay these admission fees that really do add up. There is no secret bank account from which we can pay these fees, unfortunately. And so you do kind of have to do the legwork, though, of reading other people's work who will be reading it, or submitting to the journals. Like Copper Nickel they partnered with Milkweed for a prize that I love, and then they really do a good job of publishing a diverse array of authors in that prize, and finding spaces like that. And then in terms of like once the book is picked up, it was a really positive experience. I think I ended up really loving my cover. I think one thing to think about is like you're going to be working with someone whose job it is to get your book out there, and you really need to fight for yourself and what you want it to look like and be like. And I think it's fair to say a lot of bigger presses are definitely marketing you based on your identity, and I don't necessarily think that's always a great thing. So to make sure you are not being tokenized or being like essentialized in some way as part, like your book should represent you, or if it's not like super autobiographical, your art in some way. And making sure that you stand firm and stay true to that throughout the process. I didn't have any big issues with mine, mercifully. and Kate and Redhen are fabulous, and I really love them. So that's been a blessing. But I've heard horror stories from across the spectrum of just the difficulty of once you get the book picked up, and thinking it's going to be kind of like this great press tour. It's like, no, like, you'll be organizing your own readings. You're not going to be getting a lot of money for these. I think your press might organize the reading, but they're certainly not going to pay for your travel. And so the realities of that it is work. Like, I have never been more tired than I was when I was actually able to get several readings in a row and I was traveling a lot. And I find that kind of similar to being in an academic space. I find like campus visits for either readings or like job talk interviews exhausting and extractive. Obviously it's great, they're hopeful, maybe you'll get a job, maybe you'll get to meet some people at your reading, and there's people to come like listen to you read, but I think sometimes we forget about all that goes into that, and that we are all people.
Absolutely.
And I think in terms of like, as you mentioned earlier, like students and queer folks maybe not feeling comfortable sharing their work. I mean, I think people should share work that they are comfortable with. I think even there's even poems I would not send out for publication. I think there's some things I've written that I will never try to get published. But to take that very seriously and to only send out things that you are willing to have in the world. And I think that's another way that you can kind of create a nice boundary and take care of yourself. and maybe everyone has to deal with that, but I think especially
Yeah.
like in this state, and for
Yeah.
especially queer poets of color in this state, which we don't have a lot of,
Yeah.
because some of them find it quite hostile. We do have lots of fabulous queer poets of color in the state, but they seem to be facing much more hostility than those of us who are white or cisgendered, and so I think it's important to lift those people up when they have a project coming out, to work with them, to like be in artist space with them, and I don't know, I'm hopeful that we will move Utah in the right direction. And also, and even for people, students who have like left the church, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to navigate here. And I think in my undergraduate courses, working with students, they've seemed very open and hungry for texts that are obviously very different from what they've read. I mean, we read some like biblically inspired texts. I'll even assign some psalms. Like, I mean, we want to talk about a violent book. If you've read the Bible, they're like bashing babies' heads against rocks and like completely setting cities aflame. Let's not pretend like there isn't violence in this text that we are holding very high in this state and others. And so we talk about that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. Matty, where can people find you?
So my website is mattylane.com. That is my primary digital footprint at the moment. You can also find Deciduous Queen at some booksellers somewhere. Perhaps not everywhere.
Which you should definitely check out. You can find this video and others like it at our playlists on thepoetryvlog.com/thepoetryvlog.
Should we like and subscribe?
We should.
Okay. Go for it.
Please like and subscribe and help support this channel and others like it. And that is all for today.